I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Mickey Huff of Project Censored. Yes, it's Mickey's annual visit to the show to discuss Project Censored's State of the Free Press 2026. The book that covers all the news that the mainstream tried to ignore. And this edition of the book marks the 50th anniversary of Project Censored. So we'll be talking a lot about that and the problems we see in media today, such as corporate consolidation of the media landscape and junk food news. All that and more on this edition of Parallax Views. Before we begin the conversation, I'd like to remind you that it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. So please support me on patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And also, if you can, please check out my one and only sponsor, the only sponsor outside of you, the listener, that helps to keep this show going, wallstreetwindow.com. That's Mike Swanson's wallstreetwindow.com, where you'll get the best trading and financial tips and news. I've had listeners make return on investment from Mike's trading tips, and also, if you sign up to the newsletter, you can get a copy of Mike's ebook for free, entitled The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. Once again, wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Mickey Huff. Welcome back to Parallax Views for our annual visit from Project Censored, Mickey Huff, who edited the latest volume of the State of the Free Press 2026, a Project Censored effort that we talk about annually with Shaylee Vodel and Andy Lee Roth. How are you doing, Mickey?
Hey, G, I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me back on. It's always great to be on with you and discussing the current state of our free press. This is
this is the 50th anniversary edition too,
yeah,
isn't
it's
it?
the 50th anniversary edition. So the project turns 50 in 2026. So we started the celebration with this book. And a lot of the themes sort of, we kind of went back and reflected on, well, where and why and how did Project Censored get started in 1976? And what we couldn't help but notice is that we still face many challenges to the free press. We still have many different forces exerting their influence on what the public get to hear, see, read, and so on. We have far fewer corporations that control most of what we hear, read, and see. When Project started, it was prior to Ben Bigdickian's media monopoly in the early 80s. When Ben Bigdickian wrote that book, he bemoaned the state of the press when only, quote, 50 corporations owned most of the media. Now we're down to fewer than a half a dozen. And as you and I speak, Netflix and Paramount are duking it out over Warner Brothers, with Trump relatives, a corrupt FCC, Saudi Arabia. I mean, I don't know. You couldn't mash up a weirder series of things for a fictitious movie. So, I mean, truth is stranger than fiction, I guess. But, what we did in the reflection of looking back, we didn't just look again at the highlighting the underreported stories. We kind of looked at it through a half-century lens. Where have we made inroads? What are some things that are happening that are positive for the state of the free press? There are a lot of independent news outlets, albeit many are struggling. But there are many independent avenues, and there are many independent journalists doing the kind of public interest ethical journalism that's necessary to maintain a democratic republic. So we critique the corporate press, as you know, in each of the year's books, but we also give accolades to those who really tell the stories the public needs to hear. We review what's happened to past stories. We talk about the current scourge of junk food news and how that pushes important stories out of the news cycle. News abuse is a chapter we do deconstructing propaganda every year. This year, no exception. And we are unfortunately looking at what happening in Gaza once again, because the corporate media continued to fail to accurately cover what's happening there. And we always have a solutions journalism approach with Media Democracy in Action, where we highlight First Amendment individuals and organizations that are doing work that we find really significant. This year, we highlighted Consortium News with Joe Lauria. That's Bob Perry's old outfit, going back to Iran-Contra. We looked at Drop Site News with Ryan Grimm and Jeremy Scahill. Um, it's important again to be critical and affirmative. So we don't just bash things. We deconstruct and critique things, and then we illustrate, well, where are things happening in ways that we think are more fitting with the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, and how are people really pushing back against a lot of the negative things we see happening around the Fourth Estate, including very blatant, public, unbridled attacks on the establishment press itself from the current administration. So if we run 50 years, JG, you'll know, um, Project Censored came out of the ashes of Watergate. And that's really why Jensen started the project, because he wondered why it took so long for the press to get around to covering Nixon's crimes that were happening before his reelection. So, interesting angle there. I don't know how much you want to talk about that history and how it rhymes, but
Well, how
I'm
important how important for you is acknowledging that history at this time?
Well, I'm an historian by trade. I was a professor of history for 25 years, so I'm sure my response will be biased, right? And I don't know how attuned your listeners are to history as context, past as prologue. I'm pretty sure your listeners are interested in history and
No doubt,
um,
no doubt.
deep dives. I won't take a terribly deep one, but if you take a look at the new book and you look at the foreword that I wrote, it starts. It's a rhetorical device, right? I talk about our country finding itself at a precipice, and the United States teeters perilously due to rising economic inequality and domestic division on a host of issues, from foreign wars and immigration to civil rights and free expression, with an escalating crisis in confidence regarding the role of government, all resulting in cratering public trust in elected officials and institutions. Dot dot dot. On and on it goes. And then, of course, I say, well, it would be reasonable to conclude that the preceding paragraph describes our present circumstances. However, I was characterizing the United States in the early mid 1970s when Project Censored was founded. And Carl Jensen, who was a communications professor at Sonoma State, he came up with this idea to analyze the press and look at what the independent media cover that the corporate and establishment press miss or purposely don't cover or distort. And that's how the project was born, as a student-based media literacy research project. And I think that's what sets the project apart from other media watchdogs or other groups, like the excellent group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting that was founded 10 years after Project Censored by Jeff Cohen, who also founded the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College, where I am also now the distinguished director running the Izzy Awards. So we have this sort of merging of independent media principles and its significance in the media ecosystem. But I think the history of the project is significant because we came out of that period thinking that, well, Watergate happened and the system worked and the church committee hearings were there and we learned all about the FBI and CIA doing nasty things, and the media was kind of outed for their complicity. But if the system worked, why did we have the Reagan Revolution? Why did we have the Clinton era and the Major Telecom Act adding for more conglomeration? Why did we see the Fairness Doctrine die in 1987? Why have we seen only worse and worse conglomerates that Ben Bigdikian warned about coming to pass? In other words, to paraphrase another person from the distant past, Lao Tzu, if we're not careful, we'll end up where we're heading. And we've been heading to this couple corporation sort of conglomerate, commercial, propaganda, infotainment, spectacle media ecosystem for quite some time. And we're really here. And we
Well,
now
it's
see a
it's like
rising group.
like five major companies own pretty much
We're
all of the
down,
media.
man. Yeah, we're down to fewer than a half dozen. And
Right,
then,
and well, especially with these acquisitions that are happening potentially with CNN, Warner
yeah,
Brothers Discovery. Yeah.
that's happening right now. And of course, Netflix put in for Warner Brothers, only to have the Trump connected through Larry and David Ellison Skydance Paramount folks come in and say, "Oh, we have a better offer offer. They're just buying up wholesale what they have the nerve to call the public airwaves or the fourth estate, and it's a brazen power grab to control not just what the public get to hear, read, and see, but who actually gets to do the reporting and who counts as a journalist. And so that's incredibly dangerous. And what we see in the attacks against journalists, against protesters alike, there's an assault on the knowledge industry going on in this country that is vast and extraordinary. And the demolition of things like the Department of Education, the destruction of anything that even remotely looked like even a feeble public health system is collapsing. And the fourth estate is being bought before our very eyes. All while I don't know, I guess we're all just allowed to bicker about like the finale for Stranger Things or who's going to make it to the Super Bowl. It's not the best of times in that regard, JG.
So, in regards to where we go from here in
Mhm.
this, I guess, as you put it in the book, confronting the siege on public knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's a whole section there where we talk about the public knowledge under siege, where we specifically go through and we look at various reports, not least of which include the kind of mergers and the things we're talking about. But we also are seeing members of ICE or even police, municipal police, openly shoot at clearly marked journalists. I mean, there's literally shooting the messenger level stuff happening here in the United States. We also are seeing a collapse of public trust related to the US global standing in press freedom. The United States is now 57th in press freedoms ranked around the world, down 12 steps from 2 years ago. These are not positive metrics, right? But we do go and we talk about, well, what are some things we can do? And one of the things that we've long talked about, and these are four major things that the project has basically was founded upon. And I believe strongly that Project Censored stands for these things now. And these, I think, are very important things for all of independent journalism to take a clear look at. We champion and promote independent journalism. We hold corporate media to account when they fail to provide news coverage that adequately informs the public as community members and global citizens. We provide hands-on critical media literacy training to students. That's, again, the main thing we do differently. And we make that work available to the public for free. And we also believe that increasing public awareness of, trust in, and support for independent journalism is one essential dimension of every political movement that is seeking to right injustices has to have in its sights somewhere the role and significance the media play in advancing those kinds of political movements, as the muckrakers of yesteryear taught us. Whether it was Ida Tarbell taking down Standard Oil, Lincoln Steffens taking on the shame of America's cities and political corruption, or Upton Sinclair taking on an entire food industry. We could go on and on about those kinds of examples, but the kind of people that we see in our books every year and the kind of people that we give the Izzy Award to at the Park Center for Independent Media every year are the very kind of muckraking public interest journalists that we think are doing the kind of work that other major outlets should emulate. They should model this kind of reporting and pick up these kind of stories and resist the clickbait and resist the junk food news temptations or news abuse propaganda temptations. But that's very difficult to do when so few people actually control and own those news media outlets. And JG, you just said moments ago that we're continuing to see larger and larger conglomerates. And as we speak, we're seeing more and more outlets get eaten up. And in the process, it's degrading newsrooms and news coverage, and it's growing our already problematic news deserts.
Well, let's delve into that a little bit more. Just the age of junk food news, which you guys have been covering for a long, long time now, it feels like.
The junk gets bigger. I can't say it gets better. Interestingly, the history of this is that when Carl started the project, he had some establishment journals, Carl Jensen, at Sonoma State University in Northern California, That was 76. In his first few years, he tried to get major journalists to be judges of stories and to help him not just look at stories, but he thought he was trying to help them pick up stories that they were ignoring or they were missing themselves. So he thought it was maybe a symbiotic relationship. The great I.F. Izzy Stone was a supporter of Carl and Project Censored. Walter Cronkite at CBS was a supporter of what Carl was doing at Project Censored. Hugh Downs, who was later ABC in 2020, Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, like various academics thought that the project was a really worthy endeavor to help improve the state of the free press in our country. And what happened is that instead of people embracing Carl's constructive criticism, they thought he was attacking them. And so their defense, a lot of these newspaper editors and these news people said, we're not censoring the news. That's not fair. Um, we apply news judgment, and we only have so many column inches and so many times out of the day to report the news, and we have other restrictions. And so we'd appreciate it if you'd understand some of these challenges and tone down your language. And Carl said, well, okay, that's fair. So let's take a look at what you do. So Carl, in addition to seeing what they weren't covering that the independent press was, he had his students start cataloging how many stories they covered about certain issues that really weren't newsworthy at all. They were just stories about the popular culture or sporting events or, the way they covered politics, like a horse race, without covering any of the policies or any of the positions, really. And Carl, in a 1983 interview with Penthouse Magazine, of all places, because you might remember back in the day, the magazines that many people said peddled smut often used the First Amendment as a way to say, hey, we're protected by the First Amendment to publish nude pictures of people. So they would often go out of their way, the publishers of those magazines, to highlight important First Amendment issues. So when people would
Yeah,
joke
Larry
around,
Flint and those people. I mean, they often
yeah,
people laugh when you say it, but
it's
even
true.
Playboy would cover like actual political articles
Nat
with
Hentoff,
yeah.
the great First Amendment writer for the Village Voice. I mean, yes, I mean, while simultaneously not saying that, the exploitative elements of women and the other negative things some of these publications were doing, part of how they mitigated that, and they argued this in court, you mentioned Larry Flint, right, was that they did cover important First Amendment issues, and they often covered them far more and in more detail than the Fourth Estate itself. And so Carl, in an interview, Carl wasn't interviewed by the New York Times. He wasn't being interviewed by the major news outlets about his media criticism because they didn't want to give it any attention. But Carl talked about this and said, the real challenge is that when these big media outlets came back to him and said, you're not being fair, he said, then can you possibly explain why you spend so much time on Clara Bell and Where's the Beef or the O.J. Simpson trial or any of these other things that, even if they're significant to somebody, they're not matters of national significance or global significance. They don't really matter in the lives of everyday people except as tripe and gossip. And that if they're spending the precious time they have covering nonsense, then they're worse than guilty of censorship. They've got poor news judgment. And so that's how the junk food news label came about. And Carl used it. He used to go out and survey journalists to come up with what they thought were the 10 dumbest stories of the year. And that's basically how that got started. And we continue the tradition. But instead of only making a list of these stories you can't ignore that you wish you didn't know about, we actually then show what the media could have been covering at the same time that the independent press was covering when everybody was swept up in Taylor Swift and Kelsey and all the whole business with football and this and that, and show theoretically that there's an underpinning to the reasoning behind the coverage for bread and circus situations because it distracts the public and it makes it harder for them to pay attention to important stories through all the noise. And so junk food news became a really important part of understanding media propaganda because these corporate outlets cover these nonsensical stories by design and on purpose. It's not an accident.
I don't know if we could delve into this more because it sounds like we've been talking a lot about the sort of history of Project Censored and Carl Jensen, which I think is a good idea because it is the 50th anniversary. I was wondering, could we talk a little bit more about Carl because I think he has a fascinating story going into he was in advertising during like the Mad Men era. And then he's like, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm gonna get into media criticism. So
Yep.
what's his story?
I'm so glad you brought that up, man. That's an absolutely wonderful question. And I greatly appreciate historiographically the roots of it. Carl originally, when he was younger, he died 10 years ago. Um, he was active too on our board. He was very active up in later years and was in our second documentary that interestingly was titled Project Censored the Movie, Ending the Reign of Junk Food News. That was the last film he was in. Um, Carl actually really appreciated the news media because he grew up in a household where journalism was kind of read and thought it was important. And he kind of believed that journalists were kind of superheroes in some ways. Like they went and told these important stories. So Carl actually got interested in journalism, interestingly enough. But he also realized that there were all kind of limitations because it was commercial and it was for profit and he wasn't able to tell the stories he wanted to. And so Carl went through a period where he was really disappointed. And so he got interested in public relations and advertising. And this is interesting when he described this himself. He said, well, part of the reason I did that was because I at least felt like it was an honest pay. And what he was making a joke, really, but he was saying at least I was being called an advertiser and a PR person, and I was a paid propagandist. So at least my title, what I did, and what I was paid for all lined up. I wasn't a hypocrite, right? Whereas when I was trying to be a journalist and I wasn't allowed to tell the important stories, I was being paid to be a liar. And so it took a midlife crisis and a near fatal accident that he was in where he changed direction in his life. And he went back to school and studied sociology and communications and came out a media scholar. And shortly after, he founded Project Censored. And it came out of that ethos for the belief that we can't just cede the media to commercial interests. It belongs to the people. And it is important for us to recognize the role independent muckraking journalists historically play, whether it be Upton Sinclair, George Seldes, I.F. Stone, or Carl admired Walter Cronkite, even though he was the chair at CBS. He knew that the Nixon White House called CBS owner and told them to censor Watergate's coverage. CBS canned Walter Cronkite's coverage of Watergate that would have exposed the story
It's funny,
early.
isn't it? I mean, it's funny. We've gone from Walter Cronkite and who's at CBS today? Barry Weiss.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it just has gone full 180 degrees to where we now have someone that couldn't cut it at the New York Times because they weren't the right kind of propagandist at the Times to go on and start their own heterodox publication, The Free Press, only to have that get bought up by the billionaire David Ellison, son of Larry at Oracle, and then be subsumed into CBS, where they summarily sacked many of the diversity reporters and the entire climate section. And she's seen as some paragon protector of free speech. She's doing some town hall with Erica Kirk. It's supposedly some big expose. I mean, again, it couldn't be more obvious the degree of how much of spectacle and establishment propaganda this is now being featured at places like CBS. I mean, it's just astounding at how far they've fallen.
On the bright side of things, and this gets into some of the work you guys are doing with media democracy in action and whatnot, do you think younger people are becoming more media savvy and sort of questioning the establishment media more?
I think so. And there's a whole new ecosystem, whether it's podcasts or social media influencers. I've always had issue with like influencers, and I teach journalism. And so um, it's interesting that a lot of young people talk about the significance of influencers and who they like to follow and what they like to listen to. But it's also curious and interesting to hear many young people talk about like that the corporate news media is just for another generation. It it doesn't really talk about issues that young people relate to. It talks about issues that young people that affect young people in disconnected ways, where young people aren't at the table and they're not people that are central to the narratives that corporate media talk about. And so naturally, younger people gravitate to different kinds of media where they think people, where they see some of their own people, some of their own topics, some of their own interests. And they're also very interested in understanding how social media platforms are used to manipulate information. These are very real realizations that young people have, which is why we're teaching critical media literacy to young people. It's why we're behind efforts to get critical media literacy taught in more and more schools. It's why some of our books, like The Media and Me, a critical media literacy guide for young people in K-12, we're pushing to get it adopted in more and more schools. It has been adopted in some of the largest school districts in the country, but it's too little. I mean, even the efforts we're making and having 5 or 6 states mandate media literacy training, it's too little. I don't want to say too late, but I think young people are hungry for this kind of information. And I'm now teaching a first year experience class here at Ithaca College that's all about media literacy. And only about a quarter of the students coming into the class had any media literacy in high school or junior high. Yet they all have phones and iPads and tablets and gadgets, and they're on all the platforms. But nobody was telling them how they worked or what they were doing or what data harvesting was or what privacy interests are or Palantir and the surveillance culture. There's none of it. And so we have to go back and fill in so many of these gaps. But the heartening thing is that more and more young people are realizing this. And I see that some of their distrust of the corporate media is not connected to their trust overall in journalism, period. It's just where they're now looking to build their own relationships with other outlets where their brands have just been tarnished. I mean, and that includes social media outlets that aren't supposed to be journalism outlets like Facebook, right? It's mostly older people that are now using Facebook for those things. Even though half the country says they now get news from social media, a lot of younger people are going to different platforms in different places. And that's why it's important to be teaching media literacy at younger and younger ages. And so we encourage young people to get involved in journalism. We encourage young people to research independent media. And at the Park Center for Independent Media, we actually support scholarships and intern scholarships to help pay for students to work at outlets that don't have enough money to hire people so that they can get better experience in the world of independent media and realize what an important place it holds in our media ecosystem.
Before closing out, you mentioned that you're at the Park Center now, as well as working with Project Censored. Can you talk about the Izzy Awards? I didn't have you on to talk about your work with the Izzy Awards yet, and I feel like I need to correct that because I think the Izzy Awards are important. What are they, and who was I.F. Stone?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jay. I think I really appreciate that. And in fact, we could hook up again in April. This year, the Izzy Awards will be held April 22nd here at Ithaca College in upstate New York. I.F. Stone, Izzy Stone, was a journalist in the mid 20th century that realized that a lot of the kind of stories he covered about the Cold War, McCarthyism, the civil rights movement, his kind of reporting wasn't in high demand in the major outlets, and he had challenges even in the major professional journalistic institutions. And so he went it solo. He kind of did a George Seldes, where George Seldes started In Fact in the 1940s. That was one of the first serial media critiques and that highlighted independent journalism and the importance of it. And I.F. Stone started something called the I.F. Stone Weekly in 1953 that ran up into the early 70s, where he won major awards. I'm sitting in my office here and I'm sitting next to his Columbia Journalism Award. I'm sitting next to his A.J. Liebling Award. I've got his Harvard Award. I've got his Distinguished Achievement in International Affairs Award from the School of Advanced International Studies. I mean, the guy went on to win damn near every award you could get in journalism, and he was the consummate outsider. He was the guy that was covering the stories that the other outlets wouldn't. And he persevered. He prevailed. And the Izzy Award every year that came about with Jeff Cohen and the Stone estate with his blessings of the family, that they would honor the most significant or important independent media or journalism of the year. You might notice it's kind of similar to Project Censored in that we had the top underreported stories. Um, and we actually used to call them censored awards, but the folks didn't like going around saying, I won the top censored award. It doesn't feel as good. But it's true that we were highlighting really important stories that were underreported that we thought people should know. In a lot of ways, the Izzy's does something similar. The expert judges we have of media studies people and people in the independent media world that review the nominations. There are people like Victor Picard and like Jeff Cohen and Raza Rumi, who was the former director here, and others. And so the Izzy Award is to highlight that amongst all the noise and with all the challenges in the Fourth Estate, where are there people doing the yeoman's work, the real First Amendment work that, as George Seldy says, does the work of telling the public what's really going on? So I'd encourage your viewers and listeners, check out what we do at projectcensored.org. We've got a whole classroom section. We've got a radio podcast that's been going on 15 years. We've got documentary shorts. We are on social media where the people are, meeting them where they are, critiquing the very platforms that we're still on, even if we might be shadow banned on some of them. And for more about the Izzy Award, this year, April 22nd, marks the 18th annual award. The nominations, JG, just opened on December 8th. So that just happened this week. Go to parkindymedia.org. Special thanks to my colleague Marcy Sutherland, who works with me at the Park Center, and Todd Shack, and also Kate Horgan, who just rebuilt our website. We now have a brand new website for the Park Center for Independent Media. So you can go there to find out. Anybody can nominate. You can self-nominate. Last year, we had almost 100 nominations, and we had to boil it down to about 4 or 5 winners. And you can go to parkindymedia.org to see who those outlets and individuals were. They included the San Francisco Public Press, Jewish Currents, work from the Real News Network, and Pittsburgh Union Progress. And we also highlighted the work of other folks doing good work in the Movement Media Alliance. So that's a really positive thing. I think a positive note to end on, JG. I'm really glad that you gave me the opportunity to talk about the connections between Project Censored and the Park Center for Independent Media, and the significance of things like the Izzy Award, where we are going out and we are honoring people that are doing the work in the legacy and in the footsteps of the great I.F. Stone. These people that are doing the kind of reporting now, we think, is the exact kind of reporting that people like Stone would have supported, and they're the kind of stories that he would have tried to tell.
Well, hey, I want to thank you again, Mickey Huff, for coming on Parallax Views, and I hope everyone checks out Project Censored and State of the Free Press 2020. We're on 2025 right now.
What, 2026?
2026 is the issue, yeah.
It's the 50th anniversary. Yep, coming right up. So thanks, JG, for all that you do, and thanks so much for taking time to have this conversation. I really appreciate the depth and historical background of your questions, and it's always a good time.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.